Hey, 3DMJers. This is Andrea Valdez, and you're listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. At 3dmjvault.com, we're working on creating a collection of video courses that's kind of like Netflix for competitive bodybuilders and recreational lifters. The Vault is where we take our best information on a specific topic, break it down into chapters with videos and text-based supplements, and make it available for viewing in one centralized platform. Anyone can sign up to become a member of the Vault by simply entering their email address and getting instant access to all 5 of our free courses. But if you want all 16 of our courses, including access to all the future ones we'll ever make, you can become a Vault VIP member for just $12.99 a month or $69.99 per year. If you want to learn how to calculate your calories, we have a course for that. How to execute every essential bodybuilding exercise and build your own program, we have the lifting library course for that. We also have advanced courses like how to handle lagging body parts, how to implement BFR training, how to schedule your competitive bodybuilding career, and more. To sign yourself up and get details about all of our courses, go to 3dmjvault.com. That's 3dmjvault.com. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy the show.
What's going on, 3DMJers? Welcome to the 3DMJ podcast. Today, we're going to be touching on diet breaks. While we've touched on intermittent dieting strategies a number of times on the 3DMJ podcast, this is the first time we've specifically talked about diet breaks. And there's a fair amount of research that's come out in the last couple years. But more than that, we've been using diet breaks in one form or another in our practice for a long time. And I think this conversation, we're going to try to give you both some specific prescriptive ideas on how to implement them and why you might implement them, but we're also going to be talking about how they can be used and why you might want to use them in the first place. So today, I'm very fortunate to be joined by head coaches Jeff Alberts and Brian Miner. So I think first, I'd love to get the new guy's perspective. Hey, new guy. Hey, Rook. No, I'm just kidding. Brian, but before you started coming to 3DMJ and we forced you at gunpoint to start using diet breaks because that is part of our requirements for being under our banner, did you use diet breaks? And if so, how did it go?
You know, to be honest, I used refeeds regularly, and I probably didn't use like a formal diet break, you know, of a week or more, probably until like 2017. I used it during that contest prep season. And, but since then, you know, I think it's one of those things, I think regardless of what the research says, if you go through it and you use one during a prep, more often than not, there's going to be advantages to their implementation. I think from the athlete's perspective, whether that be, you know, psychological, physiological, you know, I think in both regards they can play a role. But, you know, since then, I think, you know, I've been using them a lot more in my own. I haven't been dieting long enough since then to, like, my whole life has been a diet break since then. So it's been. But had I had an extended fat loss phase since then, I would still be using them, yes.
Jeff, how about you? You've been drinking our Kool-Aid you're the one who created the Kool-Aid recipe. So how long have you been using diet breaks in your practice or as yourself as a competitor?
Personally, as a competitor, it's more like Brian said, like more refeeds than, let's say, full-on whole week diet breaks. With my athletes, it kind of just depends on the situation. If it's a long, extended cut or prep, there's going to be some diet breaks dispersed in there. If it's someone who's just, you know, looking to, you know, shed a few pounds off, maybe 10 pounds or something like that, we may not need a diet break, depending on how long it kind of takes us to get there. So just in general, like what I've noticed with the longer you diet, and if the diet isn't, let's say, overly invasive, then you can probably extend out pretty long before you would have to like bring that tool into play. So it kind of just depends on the length of the diet, the severity of it, and the type of athlete you're kind of working with and the goals that, each person has. But there's definitely a lot of utility in diet breaks, because I've seen a lot of pros and cons out there with them.
Yeah.
But yeah, they can be a useful tool, especially if you're, let's say, at a point of a diet or a prep where the fatigue level is pretty high, where someone's physically and mentally kind of getting tapped out. Like just having, even if the diet breaks, let's say 4, 5, 6 days, not even a full week, like that can be a game changer to keep that progress going over the longer haul. And if you add in like deloads with that, so in a sense, you're bringing training demand down and increasing food levels, like you get kind of a double whammy there, where like I like to call like the supply and demand. Your supply goes way up, demand goes way down, and all of a sudden like you feel like $1,000,000, like you're just recharged and ready to go again. Because I don't know, you guys have prepped athletes. You've seen athletes get to a point where just like they're tapping out, like almost to the point where they're like just mentally like ready just to kind of quit and not even cross the finish line. And I talk to people like that all the time, where they're coming from, other approaches where it's just overly assertive, low calories, not even refeeds, just low calories straight through. It's almost like they're just running on fumes, and it's hard to function that like that just in the bodybuilding world. But then you add in real life on top of it, it's usually not a good go. So definitely, as a coach, yeah, I think diet breaks, it's a great tool to have in your toolbox.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective, and it's been an interesting last few years as a researcher. Just kind of having been someone who has, I would say, I probably have a positive bias towards diet breaks based upon our experiences with in my own personal experiences, as well as the experiences with contest prep competitors, and also just general dieters, people just kind of who are interested in doing longer cuts. In my personal experience, being able to help people reach a goal with a little more ability just to hit pause when they need to. And, I think if you frame that psychologically as a coach the right way for them, and you do it before the point they're ready to truly just crack, that can be a great opportunity to quote unquote practice maintenance and, just take their foot off the gas pedal before they then dive back in. And I think in terms of contest prep, we can talk about some of the anecdotal observations we have, but those are interesting because, like I said, as a researcher, I've seen what I think are some pretty positive benefits that don't really comport with some of the body composition observations that have been reported in the actual research themselves. So it makes you wonder, what am I seeing? And of course, it's possible that these observations might crop up if there's just more research done on a more specific population of what we're looking at, because there haven't been any diet break studies on competitors, for example. But there have been some recent ones done on athletes or what have you. But yeah, generally, just to kind of summarize the findings for the listener, if we look at the research that's out there, we've got a handful of studies where diet breaks implemented. And first, I should probably define, what the hell's a diet break? So to be clear, we've talked about refeeds, we talked about diet breaks. Refeeds are generally no longer than 3 days. I think if at the point when you're having somebody eat in at maintenance calories are roughly approximately there for 3 days, you're encroaching on diet break territory. I don't know at what point we have to draw the line in the sand, but I think it is relatively subjective. But most of the time, people are doing either 1 or 2 day refeeds, or occasionally a little longer. And full-blown diet breaks, we often discuss them in terms of weeks, a week or two. That does give this nebulous question of what happens if you do 4 days in a row of eating at maintenance calories. Is that a refeed break? Is that a diet feed? Nobody knows. What'll happen to your body? Will you explode? I wouldn't try it. It seems untested and dangerous. So anyway, obviously there is some kind of haziness as you move from what might be considered a refeed into a diet break. But ultimately one is just longer, and that's a diet break. And I think typically the guidance that you'll see someone provide in the coaching space when someone has a diet break is a little looser than a refeed, because a refeed is typically interspersed in a week of more or less specific targets for either calories or macronutrients. Generally, you're not seeing refeeds implemented if you're not tracking that closely, right? Just because it kind of implies a controlled increase in calories, perhaps from carbohydrate. But anyway, diet breaks generally a little looser, and the concept is that we're moving towards maintenance for a given amount of time. So you do kind of have to estimate maintenance or go off some off-season values or what have you. And you might have a more conservative or less conservative approach. But anyway, if we look at the research on this, the first kind of study that was really modeling that was by Byrne and colleagues, where they had a group that was doing a 2-on, 2-off approach. And this was in men with obesity. Or at least they were overweight. I can't remember their classification, actually. But they weren't like athletes or competitors, nonetheless. And the outcomes were pretty impressive, actually. There was greater fat mass losses, and that was both with the per protocol, which is, people who actually followed all the way through, and those, even if people didn't follow it that well, at both the end of the diet and at a 6-month follow-up, which I think is worth discussing in a moment. So anyway, Byrne and colleagues observed basically a 16-week diet in the comparator group, which just dieted straight through, versus a 30-week period with these 2-on, 2-off. So it finished just in roughly twice the amount of time as the other group. And you could definitely spin that as a negative, like, oh, it took twice as long. But I think when you're a competitor, sure, that's accurate. Like being in contest prep, especially when you get really lean, hanging around maintenance while you're shredded is still not that fun. But if you're someone who has a fair amount of body fat to lose and you're looking for a long-term lifestyle change, the diet break is kind of just getting back to normal life. And there's no rush necessarily. Like if you have 100 pounds to lose, like why are you in a rush? And in fact, the fact that you might be in a rush could be part of the problem why you're struggling with your body weight in the first place. And I think a big mindset shift, an important one for people with a fair amount of body weight to lose, and I'm speaking back to my personal training days here, is going, right, I'm making a lifestyle change. So whether or not this takes me 4 months or 8 months is inconsequential. I want to make sure it sticks, though. So anyway, I think that's one of the more overlooked findings in Byrne, as not just that there seemed to be superior fat loss, but at the 6-month mark, there was still greater fat loss, and if anything, it was a little more pronounced, showing that weight loss maintenance might have been enhanced by the pursuit of this diet break. Now, for those who are asking questions about mechanisms here or thinking about it like, oh, is this some kind of magic protocol? This was an outpatient study, meaning that they were not in like a metabolic ward or anything like that. They did provide them food. They did give them RMR tests to estimate their total daily energy expenditure and gave them relatively tight recommendations with provided food to eat at maintenance during the diet break periods, and gave them specific protocols to diet. But they weren't like, being watched in a metabolic ward to ensure, that the exact protocols was followed. So what I suspect happened here, but there was primarily a benefit from adherence, a little bit less hunger, which is actually supported in later research. So anyway, that's kind of the first study that entered the block. And it kind of gave us this concept that diet breaks are really, really effective. And subsequently, the studies afterwards have been a little more underwhelming. But I think instead of going, oh, we've had, more compliant participants in subsequent days and we found that the diet breaks are crap, I think it's worthwhile sitting on the topic of, well, hold on, maybe diet breaks are quite effective for people who are not competitors, even though that's kind of where it generated from. Like we started with the idea of, hey, these contest preps can get really grueling. If we take a week off, maybe we can, recharge the metabolism, regain some lean body mass, etc. Whether that's true or not, we'll get to that later in this podcast. But I think it's worth talking about for non-competitors. I think there's some pretty good utility at quote unquote practicing maintenance, getting the opportunity to take a break, and also to be okay with that, you have to shift your mindset to being a little more focused down the track rather than what's immediately in front of you. So anyway, I'd love to get your guys' take on your thoughts on diet breaks for the non-competitor.
Yeah, I think that's definitely has utility, and it's something that the way I look at them is depending on the individual, like the intent, the objective of the diet break could change, and depending on where you're at in your fat loss process. One thing you said that I think is pretty valuable and probably not spoken about enough is just that practice being able to eat at maintenance. Because I think a lot of people that, have a good bit of weight to lose. Sometimes they have this sort of binary mentality. It's like, okay, I'm either making my next attempt at fat loss or I'm just back to my previous eating habits. So having those built in, I think, is just kind of reinforcing the habits that once they reach their goals, that transition is going to be that much more efficient.
Yeah, I totally agree. Go ahead, Jeff.
Same. I was to say I agree, because that's part of the issue with people have to lose a lot of weight. They kind of say, okay, the goal is to reach X amount of, pounds or whatever on the scale, or body fat percentage. And it's almost like that's the finish line. When in reality, that's just one stopping point in a continuum. So a lot of times, you put so much energy and effort into that. Once you reach that, then the question comes, now what? So if you're not having like those diet breaks like we're talking about, it's like you're practicing what's going to happen after the fact. Like once you're done dieting off all that body fat, like you have some skill now to be able to maintain that. And I have a gentleman that I've been working with for over a year now, and he's lost a considerable amount of weight. And if we've had like those structured diet breaks, it's like, okay, let's plan this out like every 8 weeks, 12 weeks, somewhere in there. But it's auto-regulated though too, because we might hit an 8-week point where he's felt really good. Hey, I don't feel all that bad right now. I feel good. I want to keep going. So it's like, okay, let's maintain that momentum and keep it going. But once we start to get into indications that you're starting to get a little tapped out, then we're pulling back and we're going to go to maintenance. And in a sense for him, it's like 5-6 low days and then a refeed or 2 per week. And then it's just, as far as like the diet break, let's just have the refeed macros for an entire week. And if there's any excessive, activity level, let's bring that down. So it's kind of recharging the batteries so they can breathe. But, you have to factor in too, like people who are trying to lose a lot of weight and they're not contest prep competitors, you have to factor in not just like, okay, we're going to have a diet break every 8 weeks or something like it's pre-programmed, but there's life situations as far as like real world stuff, like holidays, Christmas break, Thanksgiving, kids' birthdays, and all these types of things. Like these are opportunities to have diet breaks as well. So they get even more practice with that, in a sense, maintenance period while kind of living through these social aspects of life. So I think sometimes you're the science guy, Eric. It's all good stuff and it helps, but it's almost like, okay, now we got to try to implement this stuff into the real world. And that's where some of the big challenges come into play. I think some people get caught up too, and like, I have to do things a certain exact way. So I love to game plan ahead of time and say, okay, we're going to like, here's the big picture. This is a year trajectory we're setting up here. We need to lose 50 pounds or whatever. We're going to diet break every 8 to 12 weeks. So it's all mapped out. But I also a big fan of like actually assessing as we're going through things and make judgments based on the context at hand. Because I think sometimes we can get a little rigid with that big picture setup and stick to it no matter what. It's like you feel terrible in week 4, but our diet break's not till week 8. So like, just keep pushing. When in a sense, it's probably the opposite should happen. You should probably take the diet break in week 4. And then maybe that person can go in the 8 weeks after that to make it to the next stretch. So I'm probably getting ahead of myself here, but that's kind of just things that was kind of going through my head right now.
No, I think those are all really, really important points. And it also, I like your note about like, hey, the research is useful, but you do have to figure out how to apply it. And, going back to that burn study, I think it's a great example of a protocol that probably most people wouldn't want to follow, like 2 on, 2 off. Like you said, most people, it's like, well, I want to diet as much as I can. I'll take a diet break if I have to, if I need to. And instead of like white knuckling it until the moment where you like pretty much know it's time to take a diet break, or your coach is trying to get you to take one and you're being resistant, it's probably not the best way to go. I think people associate dieting with it being hard, and if they don't feel like if the process isn't hard, maybe it won't work. So it's this kind of I remember having the same mentality in my early days as a contest prep competitor. Like when we started to do things more intelligently, as we learn more, the prep gets easier. And then you think you're doing something wrong, even though you're getting leaner and maintaining more muscle and, being able to have better balance. And it's this kind of ironic, masochistic streak that we all have. And I think that does exist in your typical dieter as well.
Yeah. You remember in 2014, my prep, it was a full year. And everybody's like, oh my gosh, you're dieting for a full year. And I'm like, well, it's not like I was dieting a full year. Because there was refeeds, there was holidays, there was like my wife and I's anniversary, there was like date nights. So all these days, in a sense, were like higher calorie days. And it wasn't that invasive to me because in a sense, it even through a contest prep, it became like a lifestyle. Like it is totally like new for me. Like all of a sudden I'm being flexible with, just this life stuff. And I actually made a post on Instagram and I went through the entire prep off my spreadsheet and I counted up the number of low calorie days, the number of high calorie days, the number of cardio days I did. And I can't remember what the ratio was, but it was somewhere in the neighborhood of like 65, 70% low calorie days. And then, a good 30% of high calorie days. Mm-hmm. So when I take a big step back and I look at that prep and compare it to any other prep I've had, like that was the prep where I probably held on to the most muscle. And not to mention not just holding on to muscle, but my training thrived. Recovery was decent for a prep anyways. But the way I was able to handle the real world, like that's probably the most balanced I've ever been. Is like trying to, be responsible as a dad and as a husband on all that. So life was far more manageable. Taking more time to diet and having more of those breaks in there versus some of my past preps where it's just straight through, where it's like, okay, I didn't account for any of that stuff and it was just more hardcore. So someone on the outside would say, oh, a year, that's hard. But now that I've lived kind of both approaches, it's like, no, like that 16-week prep where I lost 25 pounds, that was a lot harder because it was just go, go, go the entire time.
Yeah. And I think if we want to apply this to what can the typical dieter take away from this, there's very little you can take away from a 16-week all go, prep, but learning, I think there's a lot to learn from your 2014 prep where you integrated a lot of life circumstances and adjusted your nutrition to account for it. So yeah, I think that's probably why in this burn study, we see these much better outcomes. And just to give some numbers to it, just in case the listeners wondering if I'm being hyperbolic. So at like the end of the diet mark for both groups, the intermittent group, the diet break group had lost 14 kilos and the continuous group had lost 9. And then at the 6-month follow-up, there was some weight regain in the continuous group. They were down to having lost 7.7 kilos, and the intermittent group was basically the same. They were down 13.9 kilos compared to 14.1. And as far as the number of dropouts, like people who just didn't show up, who didn't finish the protocol at the 6-month mark, 13 of the 19 people who did the continuous came back for the 6-month, but 15 of the 17 came back for the 6-month in the diet break group. So it seemed to be something that, and again, these are research protocols, so it's stock standard. Everybody's 2 weeks on, everybody's 2 weeks off. No one gets individualized treatment to make sure it's a good comparison. There was no coach telling them, hey, we're going to practice maintenance. Here's how you're going to do it. Let me help you. Oh, we're going to shift this 2-week diet break so it lines up with this holiday that's coming up. It's like, no, you start the thing and you got 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, and that's it. And it was still substantially better than the continuous group. So I've always thought the 6-month follow-up information is more interesting there. And when you see that kind of success in something that is a cookie cutter approach, you know that there's something inherently useful about the approach, at least in the context of the study. So I think yeah, that might sound like I'm being too optimistic about diet breaks, but there's some pretty valuable, I think, takeaways here, because you typically don't see these kind of differences in studies. So anyway, I think that's useful. I think sometimes in the bodybuilding community, we get way too wrapped up in, can it mechanistically help me maintain lean body mass or burn more body fat or enhance my metabolic rate or do something that's going to have a measurable quantitative physiological difference, because psychology, I don't need none of that. I got all the willpowers, and I think that's perhaps not the best perspective, given when you look at who gets shredded on stage. It's a small proportion of bodybuilders relative to the grand scheme. And in our experience as coaches, I can tell you this, that the barrier between getting shredded and not is not, did you have the right protocol? It's, could you survive long enough to get there, So anyway, I guess we can start to transition to the discussion as to how it could apply to competitors.
Well, one thing, just to kind of piggyback off of what you said, I was going to mention that, like, I think, like you said, it's not the protocol itself. It's like who's willing to last the length that it takes to get into true contest shape. And I think, like Jeff was talking about his post, that's 70-30 split. I did that with my 2017 prep as well. And I think it was similar. I think it was like even 60-40, low days to high days. And I think when speaking to competitors, one obstacle that sometimes comes up when, maybe they're going from a more conventional straight through approach to, a longer timeline, is looking at that timeline just in and of itself and thinking they're associating prep with just fat loss, and so I think that's important, is to realize, almost half of this is going to be, how you're normally living anyway. And then I think another point to bring up, which you'll probably discuss this more here, Eric, but the one of the counter arguments I hear from people when trying to get them to extend their prep is, okay, well, if I'm starting earlier than I had anticipated, like, am I leaving off-season gains on the table? And I think that's a warranted, like, that's normal, natural to think that. But, when you look at natural bodybuilding specifically, I truly, especially at these advanced levels, I mean, dieting more intelligently, like you could make theoretically no gains in muscle mass in 5 years, diet more intelligently, and show up with 5 extra pounds, so it's about what you can keep as much as it is what you gain. And in the off season, I think when you look at it through that lens, it's easier to start to realize, okay, now we're losing at a slower rate, which is more conducive to, performance and muscle retention as well.
Yeah, because you could, like, even if, let's say you're like, oh, I'm going to keep the off season going 2 more months. Mm-hmm. Like, how much muscle realistically you're going to gain 2 months? Yeah. Whereas if you start dieting 2 months sooner, but you're going at a much slower rate, you're probably going to preserve the same amount, if not more muscle than you would have gained in the 2 months that you were trying to put it on.
Exactly.
What's going on, 3DMJers? Eric Helms here. Thanks for listening to our podcast. I just want to take a second to tell you about MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. This is a monthly research review that I put out with Greg Nuckols, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Dr. Eric Trexler. We cover the most up-to-date, peer-reviewed research in the world of strength and physique sport that's directly relevant to your practice as a coach or athlete. We provide our reviews in written format, but also, since you enjoy our podcast, audio roundtable reviews where we discuss the research in depth. Finally, we also do video concept reviews where we cover a broader topic in video format for your learning. For fitness professionals, you can take quizzes on MASS content and earn continuing education credits in most of the biggest certifying bodies in the fitness industry. If you want to sign up and get a subscription, head over to 3dmusclejourney.com and click on the Products tab. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening. We're talking about rate of losses now, and I think that's another kind of valid way to look at diet breaks. Is there just a non-uniform way of slowing down things? And that's been well established, like slower rate of losses preserve more muscle mass. So you could make, if someone was to make the argument that why would I use this diet break? I prefer to get into shape faster. You're making the same argument of why would I lose at, say, closer to 0.5% of my body weight per week on average? I want to be closer to 1%. And we know that that's one of the things that can risk, greater muscle losses. So this is not that different from just saying go slower, folks, that we've been preaching for ages. And I can tell you that very, 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 very few of the drug-free competitors who you see who are shredded on stage did your typical 12-week diet. That's just not what's happening in most cases, unless someone is just already shredded at contest prep start, damn near. So yeah, this is another way to do it. And given that we have non-uniform like schedules in life, we get, oh shoot, okay, family's coming in for a week. Oh, my kids in school and now they're in summer, and oh, now I've got this different change in my job scenario, or I have some family who's going to stay with me, or a holiday, etc. Sometimes it makes a little more sense just to be able to have a more contrasting approach, like a diet break allows, rather than just dieting on higher calories, but have it being a continuous approach without diet breaks or refeeds. So anyway, ultimately this is just a tool. I'm definitely not going to say that diet breaks are better for everyone in all cases, but I think I would caution people against some of the hotter, more black and white takes that are out there of diet breaks are a waste of time, because this study didn't find any significant difference between body composition in these athletes, and you're an athlete, so they're a waste of time. I think some of the psychological findings that are out there are worthy in and of themselves. So, for example, shout out to Dr. Jackson Pios. I was a part of his research group, and he did his PhD out in University of Western Australia, specifically looking and doing some of the first diet break research in athletes. And he changed it. Okay, the 2-2, that's a little crazy. Let's go 3-1. So 3 weeks on the diet and 1 week off. And let's measure performance metrics. Let's recruit athletes with resistance training experience, with not like shredded physiques, but athletically lean individuals. And in his study, he actually did not find any significant difference in body composition. He did find that during the diet break itself, muscular endurance was a little better. And he also did find that appetite regulation was better in the group that was doing the diet break. But I think what we found, or what he found, I should say, considering he really did lead this and he had that, face-to-face with the participants, was that athletes are probably going to be able to follow nutritional protocols a little more consistently in research than a group of general population folks like we saw in Burn. It's something that they have done for a large part of their lives, and they tend to be relatively goal-oriented individuals by nature. So if they are going to volunteer for a study and be given a protocol, you're probably going to find slightly higher adherence. And I think in that itself is probably why Burn found some differences in body comp, and we did not. But anyway, like I said, I think being able to have that enhanced appetite regulation and more diet acceptability, that shouldn't be just like this secondary outcome that we don't care about. That's potentially, in some cases, far more important than body composition changes, given that weight loss itself, especially in non-competitors, is something that people get done a lot, but then they often regain their weight. And for any coach who's out there who doesn't work with competitors, figuring out how to get them to lose weight during the active dieting phase is 10% of the puzzle, but helping them figure out how to make lifestyle changes that have a lasting impact is far more important. And I think that's where we should probably talk about, like we talked about the prescriptive side of this, like, okay, these are going to be 1 week, maybe 2 weeks long. You probably shouldn't do them the way research does it, of just like every fourth week or 2 on, 2 off, but you should do them, on a semi-regular but also auto-regulated approach where you think you need them and you're eating in maintenance for roughly a week. Awesome. That's how you do a diet break, folks. Box ticked. Andrea's very happy with me right now. She's smiling. So, however, I think for how to actually coach them, I think that's really important, because I think there are ways which diet breaks can be implemented which would be problematic, especially if they're done in a state where the person has felt really, really restricted and they just kind of, and it's not a diet break, it's them breaking the diet and eating everything in sight. But I think that is the critical difference, is that it needs to be something that's done preemptively, that the athlete is going, right, I'm not at my wit's end with this diet, and I'm going to try to practice maintenance. And that's how I frame it as a coach. So I'd love to hear from both of you. How do you actually coach diet breaks to help the athlete understand what the goal is and the right mindset?
One thing that you mentioned with when they may not be appropriate. I think another situation where I kind of hold off is if there's somebody that has a good bit of weight to lose, they may feel a little bit defeated when they come to you. Like, okay, I need to see something work in order to stick with it. And so at that point, unless they're feeling burned out, like I'm not going to suggest a diet break to them, because I think that positive momentum through the results is good. And I think once they're really kind of bought into like, okay, this is something I'm invested in, that, I'm going to see through, then I start to consider, okay, are we going to include diet breaks, either as a means to give them a psychological break and recharge, or as a means to practice maintenance. And I think their inclusion, I tend to include them more towards the end, simply because that's part of that transition. You're approaching that transition into maintenance. And, I think the same thing can be said for contest prep athletes is, most people can, have a pretty good stretch initially out of prep or getting into prep where they can, they're excited about the process. They're not feeling the negative effects of the fat loss yet from like a physiological perspective. They're not, sloth mode, like just not wanting to move, and I think at that point something can be said for just kind of continuing to roll with it. Maybe you go with a moderate approach with, some consecutive refeeds, something that's, I think, more in place to control the rate of loss. And then the prep moves on and you kind of get into that, maybe within, 50%, or you lose half the weight you need to. That's kind of when most people are going to start feeling it. Then I'll start either increasing refeed days to, use that as a tool to bring the rate of loss down. And then, include the diet breaks towards the tail end of prep, because I think it makes sense as you enter kind of that red zone of prep to be more proactive in having periods of maintenance just to recharge. And so I think as a whole, whether it be refeeds or diet breaks, like the further into someone's fat loss process they are in prep, the more I tend to use them.
Basically similar. Like usually it's like sitting down with someone for the first time and going over that big picture game plan or the trajectory of how we want to map this out. And the thing I think about is the rate of loss. Because I know in the earlier stages, you might be able to be a little bit more assertive, going for fat loss. So the diet breaks might not need to even be needed initially. Like Brian said, refeeds can kind of do the job as kind of like a bridge to get to that diet break. Because in theory, the longer we diet, your energy levels, your performance, the recovery, that's going to get more challenged. And someone's ability to handle stressors gets more challenged too. So at some point along the lines, those diet breaks become super important in the way I like to kind of educate the athlete, or in a sense, just kind of have them understand maybe a little bit easier. It's like, I use a car analogy. It's like if we're, driving a race car and we're going 100 laps, the tires start to wear down. You start getting low on gas. The engine might start to misfire a little bit. So you need a pit stop. You got to bring the car in to get new tires put on, get some more gas, get the engine tuned up. So that way you can get back on the track and be far more efficient. Your race time is going to be faster, but if you're just kind of gimping along on bad tires, like your lap time's going to go slower and slower and slower, and your car is going to start to really get jacked up, for a lack of a better term, like Brad would say. So, yeah, I mean, it's like the diet breaks, like they'll get more important the deeper you get into a diet, whether you're on an extended fat loss phase or you're contest prepping. To me, I don't really treat those two things any different, because it's basically almost the same type of approaches. And you have to factor in too, like the end goal is to not just lose body fat, it's to actually retain muscle mass. Like you want your end product to look muscular and, and be lean. So if you're over dieting or dieting too assertively and that rate of loss is too fast or what have you, you're going to end up looking flat, stringy, and not your best self. So those diet breaks are super important. The rate of loss is super important. And I think they just become even more important, like Brian was talking about, like in the later stages where obviously you're at a much leaner and fragile state.
For sure. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense from the perspective of contest prep, right? You mentioned the similarities, but the differences between a contest prep and any other type of diet is that you don't maintain what you get in contest prep, or you shouldn't, and for those who are following more general fat loss phases, in my opinion, unless you're just, getting your photo shoot done and you're like intending to basically treat it the same way a competitor would and regain weight, you're typically looking to sustain that fat loss. So while I think for the non-competitor, what we've talked about previously of implementing them kind of as needed is pretty important, but I also do think it conceptually makes sense, just like you would probably diet a little slower when you've only got 6 pounds of losable fat mass on your body compared to 26 pounds of losable fat mass on your body. You diet more quickly in the latter scenario and slower in the second. Other way around, sorry. You diet slower when you got less fat mass, folks. I don't know how to speak English. But yeah, same approach is you can slow down the rate of loss, like you said, Brian, and like you said, Jeff, by implementing time off from dieting. And that can potentially also give you other information. So now I'd like to talk about kind of one of those tangential benefits of diet breaks. One thing I've noticed with myself and some of my competitors is that you give me a week of being on maintenance calories, sufficient amount of carbohydrate. All of a sudden, I kind of get a reminder of how fatigued I was. Like I see what maybe a good day in the gym actually does. Oh my God, I got a pump. Hey, I pooped like 3 days in a row. That's crazy.
PR.
All this kind of stuff that you forget is normal during contest prep. And you actually fill out. You get similar effects to a peak week, and you get to see like where you have separation, where you don't, maybe where you're actually leaner than you thought, but it was just chronically flat. And it gives you not only some regain in confidence and also a reality check, but also makes you a little saner temporarily so that you can actually assess that reality. And it also gives you tools about how maybe you'll approach your contest prep peak weeks. So those are some, those are some tools that I find really valuable and kind of a secondary benefit to these strategies. So I was wondering, do you guys see it the same way? And do you use some of these intermittent strategies for these tangential benefits as well?
Absolutely. I think that's, it's a convenient, sort of side effect of slowing down the rate of loss is seeing those benefits. I think, like you said, the training intensity is something. And I whether it be an extended refeed or diet break, I know we're talking about diet breaks specifically here, but, I noticed in my last prep near the end, it was like 4 low days, 3 high. And I think I even did 3 low, 4 high. And what I noticed there is, my baseline, is probably the worst I felt all prep in terms of just generalized fatigue. But what I found was having those refeeds and then sort of structuring my training. So it's like my higher volume sessions are coming off of those. I noticed, my performance as a whole was significantly better. Usually like the best I felt in the whole week was like the first low day following the refeeds. It's like I'm still that's the most intact, that morning of that I have been all week. And then, it was more by the end, like the last 1 or 2 days before the refeed, that really felt difficult. And they were difficult, and there's no way around that. But, in addition to the performance, and I think the side effect of that, potentially maintaining more muscle mass, is just seeing, as you said, how those carbs impact your physique. And you can, you may, if you're a physique athlete, may spill over a little bit coming off of a diet break or multiple refeeds. And then you may notice, okay, 48 hours after that, I look awesome. And so you sort of find where that intersection is between, being spilled and looking your best. And as you enter those low days, which can, inform you on, if you do like a front load, for example, it might give you an opportunity to, rather than backloading on Thursday and Friday, maybe you load early in the week and then you can see, or midweek even, and see, wake up Saturday looking like you would expect based off of that information.
Absolutely.
I agree with everything you guys said. I think one thing to point out is just if we're talking about contest prep athletes that are in the leaner state, like think of overall mood and just how you're functioning as a human outside the gym. I'm sure your significant other or family would appreciate, a week's worth of extra food where all of a sudden, like, you're actually smiling again. And maybe you're getting more sleep now because you're not going to bed hungry. So your overall mood can just be significantly better. And even if it's temporary, that can save relationships, So I think it's super important that we just don't think in the context of like, how can I maximize my prep from a physique standpoint, but how can I maximize my prep, my physique, and be a better overall human? Mm-hmm. How can I function better in the real world? Because I've had, contest pro athletes say, man, I got, brain fart at work. It's taking me extra long just to, think of what I'm supposed to be doing at work, or they forget about things they should be doing. And I've even had that, those lapses in brain memory. So I think it's, that's another aspect to think about is, how we function outside the gym, not just what's going on in the bodybuilding world.
Yeah, to kind of tie into that, I think sometimes the diet breaks are necessary just to gain the self-awareness of how jacked up you were heading into it, and so even when you follow it up with another dieting, another period of a deficit, you kind of have that in the back of your mind, like, wow, I felt a lot better. My, significant other seemed a lot happier, and things like that. And so, because it's easy to just go through an extended period of a deficit and just accept, okay, this is how it needs to be at this point. And once you kind of get that ongoing reminder that, like, okay, this is how I normally act, then I think that's helpful in the follow-up.
I think it's a confidence booster too. Like thinking of your physique, like if you're at a point where you need a diet break like that, you're going to be at your most depleted state. You're probably not going to look your best. So having a week of eating like that, it could be a nice confidence boost. Because sometimes mentally, I'm just like, confidence goes down the toilet. You're like, should I even keep this prep going, man? I'm not looking all that great. I don't feel that great. What's the point of doing this? We've all been there. Then all of a sudden you get a week, you get some food in, you're like, I look awesome. I'm ready to go. Let's get this thing going again. So it's another thing to think about. Yeah.
Being flat almost makes you look fatter at a certain point. It's like you get to a point where it almost looks like you're regressing, even if you're losing body fat to some extent.
100%. And those are both things I observed during my 2019 prep. One being that I remember, so in 2019, not only did I start my contest prep, but a lot of my current crop of PhD students first arrived in New Zealand, and like they stayed with me for while they're trying to find a home for a week in some cases, and I'm helping them get situated and facilitating these meetings. I remember one of the diet breaks that I did while Berto was overseeing that prep was strategically targeted around when I had to be at AUT a whole lot, do a bunch of multiple presentations, and the goal was like, I'm going to make this, adjustment and use a diet break so I'm not a tired asshole, so I could be a good mentor. It wasn't because, that was the ideal time at my current conditioning to yada, 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 yada. However, it did, like you were saying, Jeff, it did give me a boost of confidence. Like I did this diet break and I was like, I look like a bodybuilder, and that's a rare moment when you feel like you look like a bodybuilder for a natural athlete during contest prep. And typically only comes when you've had these successful peak weeks, or sometimes, if you're later in prep and you're doing some of these diet breaks or refeed approaches. And I think the counter argument was someone would be like, well, you wouldn't be that depleted if you didn't have all these low days. But I think that's an important thing that we're suggesting is it is a method to slow down the rate of loss. So to some degree, if you want to take this approach as a contest prep competitor, you're kind of buying into longer preps. Like if you are someone who hates longer preps and you want to do a 16 to 20 week diet at most, and you want to add in refeeds or diet breaks, yeah, your low days are going to get really low and it might not be worth it. The juice might not be worth the squeeze if you're doing that. You might just need to be very sparing in your use of refeeds and maybe not even get to do diet breaks, or it's just the peak weeks you have, and I think this is a strategy for people who are okay with a longer approach so that you don't have to force those low days into being even lower than they would be.
Mm-hmm.
But
I would even say just say, okay, I can do this thing in 16 weeks without the diet breaks. There's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, let's make it an 18-week prep just in case I need to break that glass.
100%.
Because everybody's their curveballs can be thrown. Like one, maybe your rate of loss is just all of a sudden you plateau. You have a little extra time there, or you got functions that come up or what have you. So what's an extra 2 weeks for someone in that position who's confident they can do it in 16? Give yourself 18. Take some of that pressure off.
I would 100% agree, Jeff. Absolutely. For me, I think the benefits far outweigh the downsides in most cases for people taking longer time periods to prep. And I think the higher you get in the echelons of natural bodybuilding, if you're trying to get a pro card and you need to compete in multiple shows and you need them to have enough competitors, you're going to be doing some traveling. You might be competing over the majority of a year. If you want to do Worlds, which is in November, you got to plan out your schedule. If you're a pro, there's fewer shows, more time commitment, and it is not abnormal at all these days, even among people who otherwise wouldn't want to prep this long, to have to be prepping 6 months plus or for the better part of a year. So in many ways, these aren't just like our personal preferences of liking to diet longer, although I think between the three of us, at least on this call, we do have that preference. It's also just what we've seen as the kind of timeline consequences of the structure of natural bodybuilding, where the sport is going and what you have to do as a coach. When I work with some of the pro competitors, or aspiring pros, they want to keep taking shots until they hit, So it's just okay, we're still dieting, And if you are in a situation like that, you're going to need some of these tools to help them, survive the long winter, if you will.
It's not that I want to say I'm against doing a shorter prep, but I also, I guess just from my personal experience of going through, 15, 16 preps over 30 years and then coaching hundreds of athletes to the stage, seeing different, the faster approaches versus the slower approaches. I always think, yes, we can try to just think, okay, I'm going to maximize the time, I'm going to maximize the bodybuilding and get this person shredded from A to B as efficiently as possible. But more times than not, that ends up being a far more stressful prep on things outside of the bodybuilding world. Mm-hmm. And so that's not from a science perspective, but just from a real world perspective, a real human perspective, and seeing some of these bodybuilders, and the standards are just elevating. So you're saying, Eric, to get to elite level conditioning, which seems to be getting even more elite every single year, it's not the protocols that you guys were talking about earlier that has to be perfect. It's more time dieting. Mm-hmm. So again, that's putting more stress not just on your body and mind, but on things outside of the prep world. So that's where my concern is as a coach comes into play, is I want to make sure this person goes from A to B as efficiently as possible from a bodybuilding perspective, but I also want their life to remain intact as much as possible. So that's something that I really take into consideration. And like when I do set up big picture trajectories, it's like that's why I favor diet breaks, is more so from a holistic standpoint than anything else.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jeff. And I think this is probably almost a point outside of the conversation of diet breaks, but I think there's nuance to that as well. I've had some clients where they have windows, I guess is the best way to say it, and for whatever going on in their life, or just the number of things that's going on in their life, like if they have a lot of family obligations, a lot of job obligations, and I think I have made the mistake in the past, I should say, of going, all right, let's take a slower, more flexible approach. And it's basically just more time for curveballs to come at them. And it would be better to just condense it and be like, look, you got a lot going on. You have family obligations, you have work obligations, and being kind of focused on contest prep is a challenge for you at this stage in your career. So let's condense it to this month, because life's not going to stop for bodybuilding. So if we do this for 10 months out of the year, there's a higher probability that the prep will have to be aborted. I have had that with a number of competitors where I maybe took it a little too far, or I didn't individualize it enough. So I think there's probably an individualized kind of sweet zone for that. Like, you never want to rush it, period. Like, I think what we're talking about is the difference between like a 24-week prep and a like 36-week prep in most cases. When 3DMJ talks about short preps, they're not actually short, but nonetheless, I think you do have to really consider the human element and think about how do we get you there from point A to point B intact, rather than just point A to point B most efficient.
When I look at pretty much any competitor that I've ever worked with, or even know on a personal level, like everybody that's in the sport has the ability to show up in shape the way they want. Like, I think they all have the work ethic to do it. And the missing piece is just planning, like just planning ahead so they don't run out of runway, basically. I think it's, and then, as you guys mentioned, just doing so in a manner that's not sacrificing, other priorities is important. But yeah, there's a couple other points I wanted to ask you, Eric. Are we at a transition point here?
I'm ready. You transition,
Okay.
Baby.
So another benefit of, I think, having these higher carb days, whether it be refeeds or sustained durations with higher carbs. And some of this is anecdote, and I think some of it is probably backed up by research. But when it comes to like glycogen storage, like our ability to store, and like the way I think of our muscle mass is like, this is our tank that we can fill. But as we diet on low carbs, low calories, like we become less efficient at being able to fill that tank in the same window of time. And I don't know if that's related to like glycogen storing enzymes being down. I don't know. You're the expert there, but it does seem that, there's being able to spend some time with some higher calories later in prep. It's giving like a kind of a graded exposure and sort of upregulating your ability to efficiently store glycogen. Because, I mean, I've seen people, I know, sort of a new way of peaking is, eating into the show. I shouldn't say new, but it's becoming more prevalent. And I think people that would go from, okay, we're done with our fat loss, let's just do like an assertive, backload with carbohydrates, we'll fill out as much as we can. It does seem that there's a higher likelihood of like spilling in those cases to me. Like, I see a lot of people that are aggressive with carbs after being really aggressive with the diet. And on paper, it seems like, oh, wow, I bet they have more capacity to store there. They're just not able to do it in that short window. So I think having that exposure helps to kind of bring things up and increase your ability to store that glycogen. Would you agree with that?
I agree in terms of practice. Like if what have I observed? I've observed the same things. As far as explaining that, though, it's a bit of a head scratcher. So on one hand, I've seen these observations, but on the other, like if we think about what protocols have been used to maximize glycogen storage, it's not eat a whole lot, then eat a whole lot, right? It's typically a depletion protocol, mild or aggressive, that's been done in endurance athletes that allows them to quote unquote supercompensate, not even quote unquote, that allows them to supercompensate glycogen storage. I think we've learned that it doesn't have to be crazy aggressive. When you look at some of the protocols, there's some modified ones that don't require as much glycogen depletion. And I don't think bodybuilders need to go through a depletion protocol. That's called dieting, you know? So yeah, like in most cases, when I see people use like an extreme depletion protocol and then load, there's a higher chance of them being flat, right? So in one way, that kind of is almost the opposite of what you described, Brian, the idea that, but I think there's a difference between acute depletion and chronic depletion. And I don't know, you know, there are some things that happen when you've been on low carbohydrates for a long period of time. There are enzymatic changes which make it more difficult to tap into your glycogen stores once you've been on a low carb diet and you switch back, which is kind of why some of the like nutrition periodization protocols for endurance athletes haven't really panned out. Like, okay, we can preserve glycogen storage by being on a moderate fat diet or high fat diet, and then we can switch back to high carbs, but then we can't tap into it, all of it. So it was kind of all for naught, if you will. But it would be, and there's also some impacts on quote unquote metabolic flexibility that aren't always favorable depending upon the situation. But what I wonder is, are we actually seeing an issue with how much glycogen you can store or glycogen storage, or are we potentially dealing with digestion issues? Atrophy of the GI tract and like the rate limiting, like I don't know where the rate limiting step is along the whole chain. Or are we just seeing mild allergenic responses, to a whole bunch of foods, either different foods than you're used to eating or a larger quantity of them all at one time because you're introducing this big, bolus of food that you haven't been able to eat like that for 6 months now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so whether it's any of those causes or something undiscovered yet about, carbohydrate, replenishment after chronic dieting, I don't know, but I certainly have observed the same thing. And I find when people have done, I guess eating up into a show is basically diet breaks leading into your show. They have much more consistent looks, and spillovers don't last as long. You don't need to load them on as much. You can just give them a little bump, day prior, and then something more maintenance-y the day after. I remember, I've said this before, so I won't, belabor the point, but in 2019, there was like a 2-month period, for all of July and all of August, where I basically just sent a morning picture to Berto and I said, put me in, coach, because I just looked like it was game day, and that's a nice place to be for sure. And I much prefer it to kind of like trying to wish on a shooting star and get your backload right.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I noticed in my prep as well is I would look spilled. Like I would be very depleted, like in these digging phases. I would have 3 high days that were around maintenance, they're refeeds, but I would look worse the day after. But then once I started like eating into the show, I was eating more, like it was almost as if I was spilling because I wasn't able to efficiently make use of those carbs, during those refeeds. And then as I had, longer durations of exposure to it, like I felt like I filled out significantly more when on paper, if all things were equal, I would still be spilled, or worse. So it is interesting.
Muscle damage too.
Yeah, I was gonna say it could be like stress.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's the other
water retention.
That's the other point I wanted to bring up is, if I'm working with an athlete who's been digging hard and on paper, given their physical activity, everything, it's like we're we're in a deficit, like there's no way we're really not in a deficit here, but the scale's not changing. And then you introduce like a diet break into the mix or an extended refeed, you often see the scale see like a whoosh on the scale. You see this acute drop where it's almost like a deload, with strength. It's like before a powerlifting meet, your strength, 2 weeks out, you could be, you're not in a place to compete. Things might be feeling pretty terrible. And then you taper and all of a sudden it's like everything's expressed that's been there, all along. So that's something that's interesting, like when it comes to the water retention side of it, if there's been any research that's looked at that directly. I don't know.
Well, I wouldn't say directly, but if we go all the way back to the 1940s to the Minnesota semi-starvation study, where they noticed massive water retention in these guys who were doing forced treadmill walking every day so they didn't get too lethargic and got down to, they lost a shit ton of lean body mass as well, which is different from what you get in the contest prep. But they lost a lot. They were shredded at the end. They really did become like what
they
a
looked
POW
like natural
like.
bodybuilders.
They did. POW / natural bodybuilder. So yeah, they were experiencing a ton of water retention that increased with leanness. And another way to look at it is increased with stress, like Jeff mentioned. And that's, true physiological stress. So that is certainly something that could be going on. And I think on another note, when you're in a fatigued state, muscle damage is more likely to occur even with the same training stimulus. There's data on that. And there's a lot of data actually showing that in the presence of significant muscle damage, glycogen replenishment's impaired. Some of the actual machinery of getting glycogen stored in the cell is messed up. So yeah, if you're in a relatively fatigued state, retaining water, struggling to store glycogen because you're getting muscle damage and the related edema, and you're also not digesting things very well, that could all collectively explain exactly what we've seen. Yeah. So I think there's value. Sometimes, people, they get too focused on the possible downside or inefficiency of doing a diet break when sometimes it's exactly what they need. And I will even combine it with a deload. Bring your training stress down and I'm bringing you back with the maintenance, because really what you need is just to get as recovered as possible, because you're shredded and beat up and nothing's working for all the reasons I stated, or they don't appear to be. And I think that it can give you consistent, realistic idea of what scale weight is doing, what the person looks like, and they can actually get sane enough for a minute to maybe be able to have like a coherent conversation that won't change tomorrow with their coach, and be able to make some plans and agree upon some things and set forth what's the next step to get from where we are now to the goal.
Yeah. That muscle damage and the glycogen storage, that could very well be a big factor there. What we're seeing.
I think so. And it may be one of the reasons why anecdotally bodybuilders have trended towards, training legs earlier in the week if they would do it normally, and keeping it away from game day. Because bodybuilding leg days are, historically crippling exercises, and traditionally it's your bro card, Like if you don't leave the gym crippled or feel sore for multiple days after your leg day, did you have a leg day at all? So yeah, one thing I also did in 2019 that was different than prior preps is that I didn't have any leg days. I had 4 movements for each of my leg muscles that I spread across my 5 training days, sometimes 6 training days. And my legs always looked good because I never did enough in any given session to really elicit a lot of edema or water retention. Sometimes I looked a little blurry because I was obviously still inducing a training stimulus, but with the high frequency and relatively low volume per session, I probably had the right combination of protection against damage and distribution of stress. It was the first time. I used to be the guy who's like, oh, you got to be careful, Eric's quads, they'll spill. And I think what it actually was is they were just constantly destroyed because I was doing hits and 2 leg days a week. Yeah. Exactly. So anyway, folks, I think we've covered a lot of ground. We covered a lot about diet breaks, and then we went off on some hopefully interesting tangents for you to listen to. But I just want to say big thanks to both you, Brian and Jeff. I appreciate your insights, and I think the perspective added a lot of nuance and hopeful, useful application in addition to some of the more prescriptive X's and O's on how to implement diet breaks. And I just want to say big thanks to everybody for listening, and good luck with your future dieting endeavors, and enjoy your time off if you end up taking it.
Sounds good. Thank you.